And thank you all so much for joining us today. It is my absolute pleasure to kick off our fourth panel of the day. During our time together, our plan is to launch into an engaging discussion centered around race, class, and disability in the American transit systems. My name is Carla Talley, and I am a second-year law student and a toll public interest scholar here at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I am very grateful to have you all joining us today for our panel, and especially thankful for our wonderful panelists who I have the honor of introducing momentarily. Here's what we know. The very roads we travel on and the transportation systems we depend on historically have been and continue to be unequally designed. Who bears the higher burden and greater risk of harm when commuting, and why? In lower income communities, individuals who are walking are killed at a much higher rate than individuals in wealthier communities. Statistics tell us that from 2010 to 2019, Black people were struck and killed by drivers at an 82% higher rate than white Americans. Adults with disabilities are twice as likely as those without disabilities to have inadequate transportation. Of the nearly 2 million people with disabilities who never leave their homes, 560,000 never leave home because of transportation difficulties. During our time together today, this panel will explore how the designs of our transportation systems disproportionately harm individuals due to race, class, and disability, and harms those who sit at the intersection of marginalized identities. Our panelists will help us explore the types of laws and policies that are in place currently and explore how these laws fail to address issues of safety and accessibility. How do we move towards a future where there is no longer a need to navigate around barriers? There is an urgent demand for us to arrive at a place where we center the voices and needs of low-income communities, center the voices and needs of disabled individuals, and center the voices and needs of Black, Indigenous, people of color. These needs can no longer be considered as an afterthought. To explore this topic, we are extremely lucky to have our panelists who are joining us today. I will provide a brief introduction to all of our panelists, but you can learn more about our amazing panelists and their extensive experience in our program. Our first panelist, who I am excited is joining us today, is Dara Baldwin. Dara is the director of the National Policy for the Center for Disability Rights. The Center for Disability Rights is a not-for-profit, community-based advocacy and service organization for people with all types of disabilities. She works within the disability justice movement and with an intentional strategy to end racism and systems of oppression. Our next panelist, who I have the honor of introducing, is Claire Stanley. Claire is a public policy analyst at the National Disability Rights Network in the District of Columbia. She serves as the board member for America Walk, a nonprofit that focuses on advancing walkable, equitable, connected, and accessible places in every community across the United States. Additionally, Claire serves both on the board of directors and as the co-chair of the Transportation Task Force for the Consortium of Citizens with Disabilities. I'd like to virtually welcome back to Penn Law our next panelist, Professor Brittany Wilson. Professor Brittany Wilson is an alumna of the University of Pennsylvania Law School and is originally and proudly hailing from Brooklyn, New York. Professor Wilson is a civil rights attorney, law professor, and writer. And Professor Wilson joined the faculty of New York Law School in May 2021 as an associate professor of law and as the director of the Civil Rights and Disability Justice Clinic. And our last panelist, who I am thrilled to introduce to our audience today, is Dr. Destiny Thomas. Dr. Thomas is the founder and CEO of Thrivance Group, a multi-regional, socially responsible for-profit firm that works to make public spaces and public services more safe, more healthy, and more accessible, especially for Black, Indigenous, and transgender people and those with disabilities. In an interview where Dr. Thomas shares her thoughts on transit's racist legacy, which I think ties perfectly into our panel discussion, Dr. Thomas states that she believes that infrastructural racism is hardwired into the decision-making process. She emphasizes that we have literally built racist and racist ideologies and later classist ideologies into the built environments. Dr. Thomas emphasizes that this is intentional. We've created these conditions in our transit stations and on transit that only work for able-bodied people who have high-paying jobs. So thank you again to our wonderful panelists for joining us today. Before we dive into our discussion, I do have a few housekeeping items to go over. So if you have a question during the event, please submit it to the Toll Public Entrance Center through the Q&A chat function. And if you have a question that you would like a specific panelist to answer, please make note of that in your question. We will then answer questions during the Q&A at the end of the panel discussion. If you would like live subtitles for today's event, please click the button on the bottom of your Zoom screen that says live transcript. If you are seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that CLE passwords will be announced twice during this panel. Write down these passwords and enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits, and the link to the evaluation form was emailed to you in your confirmation email. If you did not receive the email, and if you are on the webinar, please find the link to the evaluation form in the chat. These passwords will tell us how long you have attended. So I will now announce the first of two passwords. The first password is TRAIN, T-R-A-I-N. Again, the first password is TRAIN. Okay, so now that the housekeeping matters are over, we can dive into our discussion. So Dr. Thomas, I would love to start off with you, but of course, to any of the other panelists, feel free to jump in. So statistics show us that Black and Indigenous people suffer disproportionate road deaths. Earlier research has confirmed that Black, Indigenous, and commuters of color were some of the only ones left riding during transit during the early months of the pandemic. Adults with disabilities are twice as likely as those without to have inadequate transportation. So our symposium has been exploring three critical questions: who can move, when, and under what circumstances? So Dr. Thomas, it would be helpful if you could give us some background on why we see these staggering statistics. Could you talk to us a little bit about the history of transit and our transportation systems and how we got to where we are today, where there is such a staggering difference in accessibility in transit?
Sure. I mean, that's a huge question that, could very much be a semester of coursework, but I think something that I talk about often is transportation's origin story, which tracks right alongside the origin story of racism or anti-Blackness in this country. Literally earliest notions of mobility and travel were all about how to transport goods and how to transport free slave labor. And so our literal infrastructures grids, the oldest grids that still inform how we build cities today, were designed to facilitate the movement of goods, capitalism, and human labor, and that evolved or devolved into things like slave patrols, right, where people who were formerly enslaved or were escaping slavery would be hunted down by what we now know as police officers, and returned to their slave owners or killed, right? And so then we have this introduction of this contentious relationship between Black people or other non-white people and the built environment and the idea of like movement in and of itself. And then we have Jim Crow, which introduced other barriers to mobility or restrictions to freedom of movements in ways such as requiring Black folks to literally move off of the sidewalk if a white person was also walking on the sidewalk, right? And so when we saw the earlier attempts to pass various civil rights laws that would make some of these things technically illegal, we saw the introduction of early investments in predominantly Black communities in transportation and mobility infrastructure, right? And this was during a time where the idea of access to anything in this country was about being separate, right? And not equal, but even separate but equal meant you can get the leftovers or substandard or subpar version of what white folks have. I call that whole origin story, I usually refer to it as transportation being rooted in design for white comfort, right? Because we went from how can white folks benefit off of the labor of Black folks to how can we locate white folks in space and in geographies in ways where they don't have to be so-called burdened by the presence of Black folks. This is where suburbs came from. And so when we ask ourselves, why our roadways, why our sidewalks, and why our transit networks don't serve Black folks, the honest truth about that is they were never intended or designed to be a true service to us, right? And so what we saw happening during the pandemic, where we saw that Black folks were didn't have the flexibility or the option to say, okay, I won't take the train because I want to be socially distant from the public. I personally wasn't surprised by that. I'm not sure why a lot of the national DOTs, the state DOTs were surprised by that. But I think what we saw there was how fleeting the notion of planning with white comfort at our core of intention can be, right? It's not only detrimental to the vitality of communities, but it's detrimental to capitalism too, right? It doesn't even benefit the capitalist framework from which transportation stems. So that's a long, boring version of why we're here with subpar transportation infrastructure in Black, Brown, Indigenous communities. But I also often talk about the construct of disability's origin story and how the notion of othering, the notion of naming someone Black, naming someone a woman, naming someone other is also bound and tied to where the notion of disability comes from. We construct disability around whether or not somebody's body fits the normative conveniences of how we've designed space, right? So in the same way that anti-Blackness has informed and even motivated folks to create non-working infrastructure, that same mechanism applies to folks who are also in non-normative bodies, right? And now we have labeled that a disability. The utility of the term only exists in the presence of othering, in the presence of ableism, and in the presence of racism. Because if our spaces were accessible, then what would be the utility of the term altogether, disability? So I think this is an important question for us to reflect on, because this struggle to this racial awakening we're all in is very much bound up in a number of other struggles. And I don't think folks realize that.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. I know I personally found it really powerful in how you framed it as transportation being rooted and designed for white comfort, and then thinking about this notion of othering when we talk about disability. So I appreciate you starting us off with that historical background. Dara, I would like to jump to you now. So one specific focus of this panel that Dr. Thomas has just talked about, as well as on disability rights and transportation justice. And so I think it's important that we understand the laws and policies that have been put in place around disability. So I was hoping that you could give us some historical background on disability policy in the United States, and if you could talk to us a little bit about how disability rights laws have changed over time and sort of lay the ground for where we are today.
Sure. Thank you, Carla. Thank you to the Spare Symposium for having me. My godchild is a sophomore at Penn State, so I'm very excited to be here for this. And thank you for my wonderful cohorts on this panel. Dr. Thomas, always respect to you and started off just well. So peace and blessings and power to the people. As Carla said, I am the Director of National Policy for the Center for Disability Rights. So in this country, and Dr. Thomas touched on it a bit, right? The othering. In 1876, we have what's called the ugly laws. Started in what supposedly, right, is a very progressive area now, San Francisco, California. I say supposedly because, you know, London breeze, the mayor's doing some things to disabled folks right now. But anyway, 1876, you have these ugly laws. And what the ugly law said was that people with disabilities could not be in public spaces, basically, right? And those laws went all the way around the country. Around the world. In fact, they still exist in some Eastern Europe nations, some Southern African, unfortunately, nations. And we're still fighting that concept of, right, as Dr. Thomas said, disabled people being in spaces. And so that trickled down and kept going. And then in the 1930s, you have the racist and ableist FDR. Everyone loves FDR, and progressives put their foundation on FDR. He was a racist and he was an ableist, and it's been proven, right, through his color lines and things that he did with redlining, things he did to immigrants, and things he did to disabled folks. He codified those ugly laws and was like, oh, instead of keeping them in your home, put them in institutions. Let's institutionalize these folks. Let's really take them off the streets, right? Like, let's take them out. And that's when you start seeing the start of institutionalization of many people. And so then you saw of course, the harm that is caused to people in those institutions. And so over the years, many people either discarded disabled folks, institutionalized them, harmed them, killed them, used them as any kind of products they could possibly use them for. And so many of you have probably heard in 1990, July 26, 1990, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was signed. I always tell people it didn't just come about, right? So let's talk about that. And first of all, many people think the ADA is about doors and ramps, about accessibility, and that is not true. The ADA, the premise of the ADA is community integration, is get those people out of those institutions and into the community, get those people out of the boxes you have put them in and put them into the community. If you don't learn anything else from this conversation today, that one, there's nothing wrong with having a disability, and two, that we as a country have not only been homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic, racist, but ableist from day one, from the moment this place was created. And that has trickled down into our lives today. So the example I give to people is around universities and schools. Well, I'll just use that. So the ADA came after some other laws. So actually in 1968, it was the Architectural Barrier Act that set up doors and ramps. Granted, nobody was using it. You could have a federal law. It's enforcing the federal law, right? That's it's like, yeah, okay. So you have this student who wants to come to your law school, and the student could roll in their wheelchair and come. That wasn't a possibility, but let's just say that. And they get in the room and the professor says, I don't want to teach someone who's like you. Why? Because they did not have a civil right. So the teacher could say that. Then in 1975, they created and passed the Rehab Act, the Rehabilitation Act. And many people will hear, oh, Section 504, they're violating 504. That's where 504 comes up. Section 504 says that any entity receiving federal funds must create, right, a civil right for a person with a disability. So back to the student, comes back to your law school, rolls into your classroom and sits. Now the professor cannot say, I'm not going to teach you, because there's not a university in the country that doesn't take federal funds for something, whether it's your food, right, whether it's a research project. The moment they take federal funds, they have to follow 504. So there you have that. But now you as students want to take this student to the local McDonald's or the, Quincy's or whatever you're going to across the street, and it's not accessible. They don't have to be accessible because they're not receiving federal funds, and they can say, I refuse to serve someone who looks like that, which actually happened and still happens today. Well, the ADA didn't exist then. They still did not have a civil and human right. So we kept working, and here we passed the ADA. In 1965, they passed, 64, they passed the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act did not cover disabilities as a protected class. It also did not include age or pregnancy or the LGBTQ. So age was done first, pregnancy was done second, disability was done third, 1990. still waiting, right, to get the Equality Act to pass for LGBTQ. And finally, there is the Dalit community. I don't know if you know about the Dalit community in South Asia, but anyway, so we're still waiting for people in this country to have a civil and human right. In the ADA, there are 5 titles to the ADA, and really, when you're looking at transportation, there is no like, oh, transportation law. It's in the 5th bucket, where kind of that covers all kinds of things, and you'll find in the 5th title of the ADA. You can go to ada.gov. There is a program there where they teach you Title I. You take a test, see if you know it. It's free. Just we make all of our activists take that test, because you can't fight for laws you don't know and understand. But Title II of the ADA is also very well used in transportation. Title II says that if an entity receives federal or usually state funds, that they have to incorporate a person's civil rights, the disabled person's civil rights. And basically says if you create a program for one person, you have to create a program for all. And that is not happening in this country. We all know that. Also, Title III extends that. And I'll just give a quick example where you see, as Dr. Thomas said, white planning and white folks being in charge of things. Bike lanes. Everybody wants to be environmentally free and let's take the bikes. We should ride our bikes. And everybody, okay, no problem. If you notice in your city where you are, there's not a bike lane in this country. Sorry, there's one in New York, Queens, New York, and that's because we fought for it on Queens Boulevard, if you're from New York, that is accessible to disabled folks. Okay. There are not many bike shares. There's no bike shares in the country. You know how you can rent a bike and ride a bike? It's all for able-bodied folks. And many of us fought and said, no, you're using federal funds to create these programs, so it should be for all. And they chose not to, right? And there's also, you know, tendencies around racism and around social economics. Not everybody has a credit card, right? So they can rent those bikes, right? There's so much around these plannings of things. And so that's the basic laws and rules around, you know, the ADA, and that's very basic for you guys. I know y'all are law school and lawyers, but just to give you a framework of how it's supposed to be used. And I've met many urban planners who never even heard of the ADA, yet they're planning something, right? They're creating a whole system and community without knowing about disabled people. I'm gonna stop there and let you go on to our next panelist, but I'm enjoying this conversation.
Thank you so much. I think it's really like helpful to have that background information as we go on to our next questions. And I think it was really important that you emphasized the founding of our country having this history of being very ableist. I think that's something that we should definitely continue to explore and talk about. So I will jump to Professor Wilson next. So again, and also if any of our panelists want to jump in after this question, feel free as well. So I know that you have experience in disability rights and advocacy around paratransit. So I was hoping that you could give us a little background on what paratransit transportation is, and then talk to us about what your experience with paratransit has been like, whether that's your own personal experience or your experience with paratransit advocacy work, and then talk to us about how the Americans with Disabilities Act regulates or fails to regulate paratransit services.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So I'll start with a visual description just for anyone who might need it. I'm a Black woman. I wear glasses. My hair is pulled back in a braid, sort of a bun, and I'm sitting in a room with a yellow wall. And I'm also disabled. Doing all of these Zoom panels has made that experience a little bit interesting because it's no longer the first thing people see about me, but I was born with cerebral palsy. I walk with arm crutches, and I also use an electronic scooter to get around. So a lot of my paratransit advocacy is personal as well as professional in my capacity as an attorney. So just to backtrack a little bit, Title II of the ADA actually prohibits state and local entities from discriminating against people with disabilities in the provision of public services. And those public services include public transportation. And so Title II of the ADA actually requires that public transportation, paratransit, be comparable to the public transportation that is provided to individuals without disabilities. So that's actually where the mandate for paratransit services comes from. What is paratransit? It is basically, in most instances, is door-to-door services for people with disabilities, because most cities or localities have what's called a fixed route system, and the ADA says you have to provide paratransit services for people who can't use that fixed route system that is comparable to those services. Things get a little bit complicated because the ADA does not really explicitly define what comparable means. They sort of have these regulations that say response times have to be comparable, and they say to the extent feasible or to the extent practicable, they say that you have to be able to get a ride if you reserve one 24 hours in advance. So there's these sort of regulations that further define what it means to provide comparable service, but everyone who uses paratransit services knows that it doesn't actually function like that in real life. So this is where I'll transition a little bit to my own personal experience. A lot of my advocacy around paratransit has come in the form of my writing and some of my testimonies. There's more to come that I can't talk about just yet, but I'll tell a story. I'm a native New Yorker, as you said in your intro. A lot of people don't know that in New York City, most of the subway system is not accessible. I don't know what the official numbers are at the moment. I think it's somewhere between only 20 to 25% of the subways actually are accessible to people with disabilities, especially if you need an elevator. I'm a native of Brownsville, Brooklyn. If you want to get intersectional, that's a predominantly Black, low-income community. And if you do the map of New York City and where those elevators are actually located, they're disproportionately not located in low-income communities of color. So that's another transportation burden. So I say all of that to say that I've been a user of New York City's paratransit service, which is known as Access-a-Ride, for basically my entire life. When the rest of New York City middle schoolers first get on the train, I had to get on Access-a-Ride. Access-a-Ride requires that its users schedule all of their trips at least 24 hours in advance. So specifically by 5 p.m. of the day before you want to travel. So that means, actually tomorrow, for example, one of my family members is coming in town. She has something to do. I don't know exactly what time she's going to be finished what she's doing. So I scheduled a ride because I have to schedule a ride before 5 p.m. to meet her, even though I don't know exactly when she's going to be available or exactly where I can meet her. So I had to pick a destination, schedule my ride to go there, because if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to just get up and go. If something changes and I need to cancel that ride, you have to do so 2 hours in advance or face eligibility penalties. So I say all of this to say, one of the major ways that paratransit tends to not be comparable to the public transportation system is its lack of flexibility, the lack of spontaneity. You have to schedule rides and everything in advance. Another way is it's often not on time. That's a gross understatement. There's also an issue with no-show rides. Specifically in New York City, Access-a-Ride will tell you when you schedule a trip to give the drivers 30 minutes for what they say is traffic or delays. And that is, I suspect that is because under the ADA and under the regulations that define paratransit, you are not supposed to have an excessive number of late trips. And weather and transportation is explicitly mentioned as one of those exceptions for why a ride can be late. So I suspect that New York City has already built that into their policies by saying, in order for you to even consider us late, we have to be at least 30 minutes late. So that's another example. Yet another example is just how the system works in and of itself. You can get on Access-a-Ride. If you were to get on a train in New York City, and let's say you're going from Brooklyn to Manhattan, you would go first to Lower Manhattan, then maybe to Midtown, then uptown to Harlem. Doesn't work like that for paratransit. The paratransit service has a predetermined route that it puts together that often has nothing to do with geography. So I could get on the bus in Brooklyn, then I could go to Queens, then they could take me to Midtown, and then they could take me back downtown to Lower Manhattan where I actually work. Has nothing to do with geography. You could be on there for 2 hours or more just to get to your destination. So this is another way that we see that it's not quote unquote comparable to the fixed route system. I've written essays about some other horrible things that have happened to me that I won't go into right now. We can talk about that later. I'll give other people a chance to speak, but the legal standard is comparability. In real life, in practical life, it is not at all comparable.
Thank you, Professor Wilson. Thank you so much for sharing your personal experience and just hearing the many issues that you've mentioned. And I hear that you say that it's not all the issues, of course. So, having to schedule these rides in advance, the issues of timing, no show, and the list going on, and how that really compares with the regulations that are in place with the ADA. So I think that was really powerful just to hear that. And I'm sure our audience members feel the same way. I am going to now jump to Claire. I know that you have incredible experience as a public policy analyst at the National Disability Rights Network, and that you have advocacy experience around disability justice and transportation justice. And so I have some statistics. Currently, 28% of the country's 3,447 rail transit stations are not accessible, according to the Federal Transit Administration. In the Philadelphia region, more than 40% of heavy rail stations are inaccessible. And additionally, Amtrak has failed to become fully compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So these are just some of the few longstanding transportation issues in various places throughout our country. So Claire, I was hoping that you could answer this question. What are some of the roadblocks and challenges faced today around advocacy and accessibility in public transit? And how do we hold transit agencies accountable to compliance with ADA requirements?
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. And this is Claire Stanley speaking. And before I go on to answer that question, I just wanted to send out support to Professor Wilson. I completely understand, as a paratransit user myself, I know you didn't even, make a dent in the different issues that are out there. So thanks for sharing. So I was asked to talk about some of the roadblocks that are out there as it pertains to public transportation. And because I was given, or you guys were given, some statistics on light rail, Amtrak, and other forms of train systems within the different states across the US, I really wanted to focus in on some of the barriers that exist there that make them inaccessible, essentially. And two things, as I was going through my notes, I kind of observed that two things I think really impact the inaccessibility of these systems are: one, poor government enforcement. Even though the laws, like the ADA that Dara was talking about, say they have to be accessible, the government has not done a great job in enforcing the laws. And so a lot of the accessibility features have fallen through the cracks. And then the second thing I titled in my notes is money talks. And it's not what you're thinking. It's not exchanging money, that kind of thing. It's more that as a civil right for people with disabilities, not just in the transportation space, but also in the transportation space, our civil rights, and I'm saying our as a person with a disability, our civil rights are tied to if we can afford them. And what other civil rights do you say that? You have a right to transportation under the ADA only if we can afford it. And I'll explain a little bit more in detail what I'm talking about, but this is something you see throughout the disability space that you don't necessarily see with other civil rights. So if we can afford to accommodate you, we'll do it. But if we can't, sorry, you can't use public transit. So I'll go first to what I was talking about, the enforcement side. So when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, like Dara said, one of the provisions of the law that Congress carved out was that Amtrak, the Amtrak that I'm sure everybody in this virtual room has taken at some time in their life, Amtrak had 20 years to update all their stations to be compliant with the ADA so that persons with disabilities could use them. Well, when it was getting close to 2010, which would have been 20 years, it was very obvious that Amtrak was not going to meet that deadline and be successful. So actually the organization I work for, the National Disability Rights Network, put out a report that talked about it, and it was called All Aboard Except for People with Disabilities. And it did a great study with the help of our 57 protection and advocacy offices to show that a overwhelming number of the stations throughout Amtrak were inaccessible for people with disabilities. So if you can't use the station, you can't get on the train, you can't use Amtrak. And so this was just a great example of how the enforcement of Congress, who gave that 20 years, and then Department of Transportation that oversaw it, just they dropped the ball. Even though Amtrak was supposed to be accessible, they just really dropped the ball and it didn't happen. So actually just this past year, there was the settlement agreement. Department of Justice went in and did an assessment based off of our report. And they have a settlement agreement now that was $2.25 million. And that's only million with an M, which, you know, it sounds like a lot, but when you think about the numerous stations that aren't accessible, is still a little disappointing. That's my opinion. But there was a settlement agreement with DOJ and Amtrak to make sure that those stations will be accessible. But the other thing I want to drive home again is the time aspect, because they were supposed to do it in 20 years. It's now 10 plus years later. And now through that settlement agreement, they have another 10 plus years. So basically the ADA was passed in 1990, and 40 years later, we might have accessible Amtrak trains across the country. So again, just showing the lack of enforcement was a big issue. And then another thing I just wanted to talk about, like I said, is money talks. There's just this lack of enforcement for legacy systems, because the way the Americans with Disabilities Act was written, you only have to make updates to what we call legacy systems. So that includes SEPTA that you guys have there in Philadelphia. You only have to make these updates if you do renovations or alterations, I believe is the legal term they use in the ADA. So until you start making some kind of substantial alteration to the system, you don't have to make it ADA compliant. It was kind of grandfathered in, I'll use that term loosely, but it was grandfathered in that because these systems have been around for decades and decades and even 100 years, like in New York, they said, well, we don't think people should have to make them accessible because it's going to cost a lot of money and take a lot of time and a lot of effort, which on one hand you can kind of get right. But when you think about it on the other hand, that's abhorrent, you know, because now these stations, these legacy systems like CTA in Chicago or SEPTA in Philadelphia, they've really held tight to the fact that they're, quote, not making alterations or updates. There's actually been some litigation that has debated what the definition of alteration or renovation is. They say, oh, if we're only doing maintenance, I'm doing air quotes for those of you who can't see, if we're doing maintenance, it's not an alteration, and so we're not going to update them to comply with the ADA. So again, I think this just kind of goes with the idea that money talks, and because it costs money to make these legacy stations accessible, we don't see it as a civil right anymore to make them accessible. So I think these are two really big barriers, is again, enforcement by the government, both by Congress who writes law, and then the affiliated federal agents, and then the money itself that goes along with it to make these updates. So I think some of the big things we really need to see, or how we can make this change, is forcing the government, the three agencies, whether it be litigation, regulation, or legislation by Congress, we need to make sure that the government is doing its job in enforcing, because kind of like Dara was talking about too, we can write all the laws in the world that we want to make sure that there are civil rights for people with disabilities, but as long as they're just writing on paper and we don't enforce them in the many different ways we can, they just kind of sit there and nothing really happens with them.
Okay, thank you for explaining those barriers. I think it's extremely important, as you kind of mentioned, as we move forward, and as the title of the symposium suggests, as we move towards liberation. I think these are definitely things that we have to be cognizant of in our advocacy work. So I really appreciate you kind of providing that background and that context for us. And next, I'll pose the remaining questions to all of our panelists. We've talked a lot about the problems marginalized communities experience within our transit systems. So I would like to shift gears a little and turn our conversation towards what's next. So I'd first like to get thoughts on this question of whether you all view the Americans with Disabilities Act as a useful tool for solving some of the problems we have been discussing today around mobility and transit, or if you think that there's something else needed, better laws or different forms of advocacy and if there are any models of transportation justice that we can look towards. Perhaps there are other places or countries that have a blueprint that could be useful to this type of work.
I'll go first. Anybody okay? Okay. Hi, everybody. Dara Baldwin. So, good question, Carla. I do think the ADA is a good law to help us when it comes to accessibility and getting things accessible. When it comes to mobility and actually specifically having disabled BIPOC people move within the community, it's not something that's going to protect us and them. I say them, I'm not a person with a disability, although they call me part of the family, so I don't care. But anyway, and I say that because what hasn't been discussed here, and I think in your last panel about pretextual stops and stuff, is in transportation, there's 5 E's. I'm the co-chair of the Transportation Equity Caucus, and please Google it. You're more than welcome to see our website, and we talk about this. In transportation, they had 5 E's for over 50 years, right? Urban developers, transportation experts, engineers have used these 5 E's. One of them is enforcement. And they truly believe that enforcement is necessary in order to move people's bodies. And so, right, and they have never, ever had the E of equity. And it has taken us 12 years, right, after the reckoning of summer of 2020, as I tell people, yeah, we are a racist society. Now they want to include equity. This is the first transportation infrastructure bill and budget bill that we've ever passed. It took us 12 years to get equity language in that bill, right? To get Congress to say we have to use equity when we're distributing transportation dollars and talking about safety. So I'll talk to that. The definition of safety is not the same for Black, Indigenous people of color, and it is not the same for disabled Black, Indigenous people of color. And until transportation systems and people who are working around the implementation, planning of transportation, NPOs, all those things, accept this and understand and know that law enforcement cannot be a part of this conversation and needs to be removed, then no, right? Those laws are not there to protect us moving around in any way. On the highway, so you all know, in the Ferguson consent decree around Michael Brown, it showed 25 to 27% of pullovers Black, brown folks end up harmed or dead. It is traffic stops that do that. It is, if you're on any of the systems that Claire talked about, right? The BART system in San Francisco, the Metro system here in DC, transit police officers, right? It is there. If you are walking up and down the streets, many people say, okay, we're going to use automated enforcement, right? These cameras are 360 degrees. They are monitoring our lives. That is against our 4th Amendment right. There's so much in the enforcement that is harmful, and specifically to disabled folks around their lives, and where they go and where they interact. And so, no, those laws have not been created. We have a political system, right? And a president who has now moved away from his promise to do something around accountability for law enforcement and is now having a police summit with a mayor who wants, right, Mayor Adams and Mayor Lightfoot and Mayor London Breeze, I was talking about that in San Francisco, who now want to increase law enforcement and pay very close attention to what this president talks about and how this State of the Union is rolled out on March 1st, right? And the increasement of law enforcement. And, instead of having a conversation of what public safety means to all communities. So I don't see that happening specifically for Black disabled people. And again, check out the Transportation Equity Caucus. We have a whole campaign on removing the E of enforcement in transportation to save lives. I'll stop there.
I guess I'll jump in. I just want to clarify. Your question is whether the ADA is a useful tool for achieving transportation justice. Is that the gist of your question?
And if it isn't, or if there are other tools that you think would be better, so better laws or different forms of advocacy or any models of transportation justice that we can look towards.
Sure. I mean, I think that the ADA is a useful tool. I don't think it's a sufficient tool, right? So if we're going to put it in law school parlance, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. 2 years ago, when everyone was celebrating the 30th anniversary of the passage of the ADA, I said over and over again in interviews that the ADA is a floor and it's not a ceiling. We also know that for people of color with disabilities, people with disabilities who have other marginalized identities, your ability to take advantage of these laws varies widely based on that, right? Your access to lawyers, right? Because lawyers are often post hoc mechanisms. Something has to happen to you first, and someone has to be aware that your rights were violated, and then you have to be able to access those supports and services. So I think in that way, the ADA is limited, like all laws are limited. But what I tried to illustrate a little bit in my initial remarks was some of the ways that even the law itself allows for people's interpretation of it to circumvent what I think its intentions are, right? They wrote that paratransit service has to be comparable to the fixed route transportation system, and then we see policies and practices that are developed that, well, I'm not violating the law, but you didn't exactly say what this was, so I'm going to get around it this way. And so there's always going to be that gap within the law. And Claire mentioned that money talks, and I kind of want to remix your question a little bit to talk a little bit about the implications of some of the stuff that we're talking about. Because I mentioned lack of flexibility, I mentioned the poor routing and all of these things, but the consequences that has for people with disabilities, talking about money, people's jobs are on the line because of this, because transportation, we know, is directly connected to employment, educational attainment, healthcare, all of the things, right? So in terms of the economic consequences of not being able to get around, but then also how money factors into how the paratransit system in particular operates. Here in New York, again, because that's where I live and that's where my most immediate experience is, Access-a-Ride is contracted out to private carrier vans. So you have this federally mandated program that is managed by the city, that the city then contracts out to private individual businesses and brokers, if you will, right? So who may or may not even be getting paid based on the miles that they transport us. So all of these things are not things that can be fixed necessarily by laws or legislation. And I say that to say, because you all are law students, the law alone will never be a solution to all of our problems. So is it necessary? Absolutely. Is it enough? Not at all.
This is Claire. I'll piggyback right off of that. I completely agree that it's more of a floor, not the ceiling, and so much more needs to be done. In general, I think the ADA is a great place to work with. I think one of the things that I've personally observed through my legal education and just through observing is that the ADA has taken a big beating through the litigation space. I could be preaching to the choir if you guys know a lot about ADA law, or perhaps not. But the ADA, it wasn't transportation related, it was Title I work related mostly. But the ADA had to be amended back in 2008 because the Supreme Court really took a beating to it and really ate away at what the intent of the law was. And so it was amended in various capacities. And now if you talk to almost any disability rights attorney, they will run from something ever getting cert in the Supreme Court. In fact, there was just a case just within the last month or so that was going to go to the Supreme Court, and we were terrified, and thank God they decided to step away and not go to the Supreme Court. But I guess I'm just saying this because the ADA is a great law, but because we live in a common law system, there has just been a difficult history in the legal system of cases just not agreeing with the court's outcomes, and it really eating away at the intent that I think most of us want. And like I said, or wanted to point out, one of the things I had said earlier was the debate over what the definition of alteration is at these train stations. So what I think most of us would agree, of course it triggers the ADA, and now these legacy systems need to start making their stations more accessible. Like I said, it's gone to court and people have debated over it, which, as an aside, side frustrates me because I'm like, how much are you spending on litigation when you could be spending it on updating your stations? But all that to say, you know, as a common law system, the ADA has not fared well, unfortunately, in the interpretation of the law. So.
And I would add, as someone who has worked in civil service at various departments of transportation, that this accessibility is probably one of the only topics of discussion outside of racism where DOTs and transit agencies are even asking this question or having like a philosophical crisis of how to apply the law. In every other facet, when a DOT or transit agency wants to innovate, when they want to implement a new project or program, they do it. We've seen the electrification of buses happen within a span of 2 years and be fully funded by both Republican and Democratic presidents, right? And like no environmental process has happened. I have an issue with that because those depots are showing up in Black communities, right? No environmental analysis, no long drawn out review by the city attorney's office to make sure there's no legal issue. We saw the same thing with the rollout of shared mobility scooters and those bike shares. Also have an issue with that. Although I think there are great additions to first last mile solutions for able-bodied folks. When I looked at the map of where those devices were being deployed in Los Angeles, there was a donut hole where all the Black people lived, right? So they know how to move quickly to create access for who they want to create access for. And I think this is because in the same way we have a crisis of representation when it comes to racialized people working at these institutions in decision-making positions, we also only have able-bodied people in decision-making decisions, and going beyond tokenizing representation to really understand what it looks like and means to hire a workforce that is ideologically diverse. Because we've also seen, as we've brought up Mayor Breed a couple of times, it's not enough to just say we hire someone from the so-called impacted community. Some of the things that I've seen while sitting in these buildings, when we talk about why, like the question will be raised internally, like, why aren't we talking about accessibility here? One, it's something you're not allowed to talk about, right? We are trained, depending on how high ranking you are, you're trained not to even mention access in an email because they don't want that to be discovered. There's this fear of litigation. If we go down this path of how to make this sidewalk accessible, the folks who've never had access across the street will notice. And now we are opening ourselves up, we're exposing ourselves to litigation. Then it goes even further in terms of capital interest, because if you, excuse me, that was my phone. If you are making transportation accessible, if you're making travel accessible, then what then is required of the origin or the destination, right, that folks are going to? That's also very expensive, rightfully so. And then I think lastly, what we don't talk about is white mediocrity, and how a lot of what we think is like ableism and racism is really about folks not being skilled to do the work, and folks being in these positions because of nepotism and meritocracy, false notions of meritocracy, and then working in these cliques and these silos where there's no one there to really hold them accountable for having the outcomes that these laws are, the spirit in which these laws were created. Like folks literally don't know what they're doing, and I think we take that for granted too.
Thank you all for sharing your thoughts on that. I feel like this entire time I'm just like rushing to type all the great things that you all are sharing. So thank you for that. We have a few more minutes, but I know you all kind of touched on this question in your previous answers, but I really wanted to make a directed point to ask this. So accessibility could look differently based on one's race, their geographical location, or the community that they inhabit, their access to wealth, whether or not they are someone living with a disability, et cetera, et cetera. So this is not to mention the experiences of those who are facing multiple forms of oppression, who are situated at the intersections of multiple marginalized identities. So I would really love for us to explore how the concept of intersectionality is crucial in the topic of transportation justice, and hear what you all think are some of the practical ways we can design transportation laws and policies in the United States in a manner that is intentional about affording protections to individuals and communities through an intersectional lens.
I have lots of thoughts on this, so please bear with me. And I'm trying to figure out how to illustrate this. So I mentioned previously an essay that I wrote. It's in a great anthology that you all should check out if you haven't already, Disability Visibility, First Person Narratives for the 21st Century by Alice Wong. It was also adapted for This American Life, and it's on long reads, and it's all about my experience on Accessibility. And specifically, something happened to me on Accessibility that prompted me to write the piece. And it wasn't just, I didn't write it just to say paratransit needs to be improved. I wrote it because I wanted to illustrate how lack of reliable paratransit services is an intersectional issue. And I'll say just in short that transportation justice is a gender justice issue, right? You know, I can't tell you the number of times I have been propositioned on paratransit, right? We don't talk about if you can't get around, quote unquote, independently, or just hop on the train or hop on the bus, you were dependent on people assisting you onto rides. Strangers that you don't know, who have, some of whom have very limited actual training in dealing with people with disabilities, don't actually care about people with disabilities, people driving you to your house and back again, who know where you live, right? Drivers who have asked and tried to get into my home. You know, transportation justice is a gender justice issue. That's an intersectional issue. It's a racial justice issue for all of the reasons we've just discussed. For those same reasons, gender overlaps with race. I told you that in New York City, the places where the train is accessible don't happen to be low-income communities of color. That means you disproportionately have disabled people of color on paratransit, disproportionately have disabled low-income people of color on paratransit, whose options are limited, whose ability to get around is limited, and whose treatment by the paratransit system reflects those stereotypes. I feel like I do a much better job of illustrating this in the essay, so I'm just gonna say go read it. But it's not just about accessibility, right? It's not just about the laws, it's about the real life implications that come along with having to put your safety and your ability to get around in someone else's hands, in the hands of a system that doesn't care about you and doesn't understand you. So that's just one example of how this issue is intersectional, because like Audre Lorde said, we don't lead single issue lives.
Yes, yes, amen, my sister. I'm right there with you. And yes, please get Disability Visibility. It's an excellent book. And I would just add, you know, it hasn't been discussed here, formerly incarcerated community, and how their inability to actually obtain, some cities are doing better, but to be able to afford, right, the Metro cards or whatever it is, you know, you use in your system. Even our students, not like here in DC, we passed a law that students ride the trains for free, and that took almost 7 years, right, to get done. Like, it's like, are you people kidding me? These families can't afford the, you know, the train rides and fee, you know, fees. And those kinds of things. So yes, you know, intersectionality, people use this term in all kinds of ways, and collective liberation, right? It was said, I work from disability justice. There are 10 principles of disability justice. The first is intersectionality. The last is collective liberation. It's like leave no one behind, as my sister was saying earlier, Brittany. And we do not see, because of what Dr. Thomas said, those people at the table. I keep telling people, right, the only way you change policies and laws is that those who are closest to the problems are closest to the solutions. And we do not see that happening, specifically in transportation, urban development, community development. It is a very white, upper middle class, wealthy, cisgender, mostly male profession. And so therefore that's the concept, that's the realm of what you get. And so leaves out so much, even right, our immigrant and refugee communities, again, back to having law enforcement on trains and at bus stops and at bus centers, hinges them from using public transportation other than just socioeconomic status things. And even our disabled folks, right? And that's the other thing, multi-marginalized. Disabled people are all things you think of it. In fact, in reference to religion, right? We have, unfortunately, right, 2 young girls killed, right, in Seattle for wearing a hijab on a bus, right? Their hijab, their head wrap on a bus. And then another instance where someone tried to save their lives and he lost his life, right? And so, all of the things that marginalize our lives affect your mobility, your ability to move. And again, I don't care if you're in a car, if you're on a bus, a van, if you are walking. And the last thing I'll talk about, because also people really are not talking about, and we really need to in this community and social justice, is autonomous vehicles and the creation of autonomous vehicles and the creation of implementing AI, automated intelligence into these programs, again, created by mostly white men. And how that's happening. Many people will talk about the safety. Of course, I want the safety around it. Many of the AV vehicles do not recognize a wheelchair, like they can't recognize a mailbox. That's what, right? And that's about how high a person sits in a wheelchair. So how are they going to recognize that? But let's talk about also the technology being used to harm people, right? It being thought that it'll be okay to make all buses and vans and passenger vans in this country autonomous vehicles, where there's no bus driver and there's no one, right? No person, no human being on those vehicles. Now, my sister here, Brittany, just talked about her experience with paratransit. Can you imagine being on paratransit with no one, right? On buses we've seen, but right, people have babies on buses, they have heart attacks, someone needs oxygen, they need, they need safety. The bus driver does kind of control the bus, and just those different things. Or imagine being the only woman to get on a passenger van with 14 men. Right, or a trans person to get on somewhere with 14 men, or a Black person to get on with all white people, and there's no one there to control that situation. These are coming from white people who are living their lives in their space and then trying to create systems of transit and systems of mobility for everybody. And so those voices are left out.
Okay, thank you for sharing that information. I do want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I will announce the second and final password for those who are seeking CLE credit for today's event. So the second password is BUS, B-U-S. Again, the second password is BUS. And that was truly such an engaging discussion, so I really do appreciate all of you sharing your experiences, your thoughts and perspectives. I think we have time for a really quick question. I don't want to not get to any of our questions submitted. So Dr. Thomas touched on how one obstacle is that those who are doing the planning and decision-making are not possible, or not people who are living with disability. What are the mechanisms needed to change that? And similarly, how do we restructure transportation planning processes to find and center the community voices of people living with disabilities?
This is a great question, difficult question. I'm going to try to speak succinctly. Civil service processes were designed to, in the spirit of equity, and we all know that that hasn't been the outcome. And so I think the question of how we get representation in these positions is a huge question. Because it's such a huge question, one of the things that we are working on at the Thrivance Group, and the reason Thrivance Group exists, is because I don't believe that you have to be a civil service employee or go through a traditional urban planning training in order to design cities and to write the policies that, you know, that govern them. I think there's much more value in folks who are artists, folks who are social workers, folks who have raised children in one way or another, or taking care of an elder, right? Like, I think there are other contexts that are more appropriate than urban planning school. So we have this model at Thrivance Group called unurbanist planning, where we're intentionally creating spaces where these unurbanist experts or people can be centered in the discourse, and the so-called planners take a backseat and have to watch and engage from a space of learning. I think more of those spaces are important. I think also I don't want to leave today without mentioning that youthhood is an important thing for us to center in this conversation, and that disabilities look very different in youthhood and in childhood. And I'm thinking about Elijah McCoy, who the video of his death while walking down the street still haunts me. I can still hear him trying to explain to the officer, I'm different. You know, that's like the best way to put it. And the fact that he wasn't understood says everything that we need to know about what's wrong with our systems. Similarly, including cognitive disabilities in these conversations, so that as we make these advances, folks who are just different cognitively aren't being left behind. And then something that planners already know how to do is design for natural inclination. We do this thing as transportation planners where we look for so-called natural patterns of travel, and literally where you see dirt, grass turning into dirt patches, you kind of can identify where a sidewalk should be. And I think if we had less hostile infrastructure in the built environment and did not criminalize and penalize people for having disabilities and allow folks to be visible outside, we will start to see those natural travel patterns show up and have more meaningful, more intuitive design for folks. But to be 100% real, if we are not abandoning the notion of transportation and policing having to happen in tandem, and if we are not removing all of the heteronormative thinkers and you know, white centering service providers from these spaces, we'll never get anywhere. We need to start firing folks, to be real, and we need to start creating new spaces for this work to get done.
Thank you.
This is Claire, and just to build off that really quickly, I think it's really important too that when we do that we're truly getting people engaged and involved in a real way, and not just having quote unquote the token person to fulfill that spot, whether it be gender, race, disability, sexuality, that, you know, you show around, oh, this is our token insert person here, and then nothing comes of it. So really making sure they're engaged in the process.
And this is Dara, real quick. We did a toolkit, and you can find that. I'm going to send that to Carla so you guys can have that around exactly what Dr. Thomas said. The Transit Center and the CNT of Chicago, we worked on it for about 18 months and put that together for transit people, planners, and people to use, and it's an equity toolkit.
Awesome. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists. You all, thank you so much for just taking the time and sharing all of your wealth and knowledge. And I really appreciate just being able to be in conversation with you all. And I am also thankful to our audience members for joining. We will start our next panel closer to 3:50. And the next panel is titled Zones of Exclusion in the City of Neighborhoods. So thank you again, and I hope that everyone can stay tuned for the next panel.